if we always have to watch our back for avoiding to being wrong, then nobody will dare to do difficult, ambitious things, because when you enter new grounds, you can be wrong, and you can be wrong for a million reasons.
Adriano Aguzzi is professor of neuropathology and director of the Institute of Neuropathology at the University of Zurich. Adriano is an EMBO member and a winner of the EMBO Gold Medal. The Aguzzi Lab focuses on the molecular basis of prion diseases and other neurodegenerative illnesses. In 2016, Adriano was intrigued by findings published by Mao et al. In the journal Science. The paper identified a new molecular player in the pathogenesis of Parkinson's disease. It proposed that the immune checkpoint molecule LAG3 bound pathologic alpha-synuclein and contributed to its cellular uptake and transmission from neuron to neuron. The Aguzzi Lab decided to follow up on these exciting, unexpected findings. We spoke to Adriano about what happened next. Welcome to the EMBO podcast.
Let's start a bit with how the sausage is made. So the story behind this paper. As it is right now, it reads as a replication study. Was that how it started out in your lab? Did you set out to replicate the findings from Mao et al.?
No, not at all. Actually, when Ted Dawson and his colleague published the surprising findings that LAG3 is a receptor for fibrils, for synuclein fibrils, we got very excited. And actually, my goal was to discover antibodies against LAG3 that might be therapeutic. And in the past several years, my lab has established a high-throughput pipeline to discover antibodies against interesting proteins in very large human populations. I mean, we are talking 100,000 people or 200,000 people. So we have been systematically accruing and biobanking every blood sample that came of any patient who was treated at our hospital and had consented to the storage of the blood. And we have done this for the last 5-6 years. And so now we avail of a huge collection of blood samples. We also know exactly why the people were in the hospital, what was their medical history, what was their medication. And now we can do very rapidly correlations to any biological phenomena that come up. And of course, we are doing also COVID studies with this. But one idea was, okay, maybe there is LAG3 autoimmunity, and maybe these people are protected against Parkinson's, or maybe, and if that is the case, then maybe it's worth cloning the antibodies out of these people and see whether they can be used as therapeutics. So that was what got us really excited about the LAG3 story, and because we felt that we had a technology that not everybody has, we thought, okay, this is, let's jump on it, let's do it. And so that's how the thing started. And then Mark Emmenegger, who was a student at the time and who has set up all these high throughput methodologies, he started to actually look into, okay, I mean, how we need some, we need some controls. We need some neurons that express LAG3 so that we can actually see whether the antibodies bind to the neurons. And then came the big surprise that we couldn't find it, and that was a bit shocking.
What happened next?
Well, what happened next was that I really was trying to be careful. Let me point out something that is really important to me. On the one hand, I think that the results reported by the Dawson lab are artifactual. There is no way around it. I wouldn't, I said not universal a bit jokingly, but the fact is that these results cannot be reproduced. And now, however, at the same time, I really want to say, and this is central to my Weltanschauung as a scientist, is that nobody should be ostracized or demonized for being wrong. I think that I think that this kind of culture of shaming, of ridiculing people for being wrong is the most awful thing that is happening in science, and it is amplified by the social media, and it's terrible, and for many reasons. But it's also stifling, because if we always have to watch our back for avoiding to being wrong, then nobody will dare to do difficult, ambitious things, because when you enter new grounds, you can be wrong, and you can be wrong for a million reasons. And I am absolutely convinced that that Dawson and his people were wrong. In a way, they were wrong for the right reasons. They were wrong because there may have been some experimental variable that they couldn't have possibly been aware of, and I don't know what it is, but that misled them. Now, this happens all the time, and in fact, this is the essence of the philosophy that was formalized by Karl Popper, that says that in the end, science progresses through consecutive falsification of working hypotheses. And so you never verify, you never prove a hypothesis. What you do is that you disprove something that was claimed before. And in a way, this is what happened here. And I don't think there is anything wrong with it. Quite the contrary. I think this is exactly how science works. And so I really want to point this out. And in this context and in this spirit, once we were totally convinced of our data, the thing that I did was to write to Ted Dawson and to tell him, look, Ted, we have this situation, and I'd be happy to share the letter, but it was really, trying to be as amicable as possible. This is unpleasant, but there is nothing wrong with it, and it has happened to me in the past, and it will happen in the future, and it's a part of doing our business. So that's in essence what happened, and in fact, Ted answered also very cordially, and of course, he was not pleased, and of course, nobody was, and I wasn't pleased either. I mean, I didn't set out to prove anybody wrong here, and but I think that this was handled actually in a very good and very professional way. I think that it was an educational experience for everybody, because my coworkers in the lab who did the experiments were originally very angry because they had put a lot of effort into this, and the project was slipping away. But in the end, what I think everybody has seen is that this was actually successful. I mean, we ended up publishing a paper in Embryo Molecular Medicine, which is the top journal in molecular medicine, as you all know, so even in terms of career advancement, I think that nobody was really lost anything here, and people realized and appreciated that.
But before it got to Embryo Molecular Medicine, it went through Review Commons, right? And I want to read from, and one of the great things about Review Commons and about Embryo Molecular Medicine is that the reviews are available for the scientific community, as is your reply to the reviewers and your revised version. And I think one reviewer in particular that people can go either to the early evidence space or to bioRxiv and look at the Review Commons comments, really had a two-phase response that encapsulated the problem and a bit the solution, which are these new platforms. So the reviewer, who was overall very positive, nevertheless starts the summation on the significance of the work, saying these negative findings about lag in alpha-synucleopathies, I'm glad I got to say that, shown in this manuscript do not provide any new insight into the mechanisms of alpha-synuclein propagation. Now, at many journals, traditionally that would have been the end.
Yeah, exactly.
What the editor would have written back and saying, and it's true, because you are showing that what should have been a new mechanism actually doesn't work, right? And this is a very, very important result clinically, and it's an area where really we need to advance in basic physiopathology. But that line would have been the end of the process in many different places, right? And then it would have been probably in one way or another repeated ipsis literis in the editorial letter. But he continues to later, or he or she, I don't know. That's my own implicit bias there. It's to say the data shown in this manuscript are convincing, and the information is very important in correcting the direction of disease treatment and research. So that, I think, if we had didactically paid someone to write a review for Review Commons, we couldn't have done better. It really says, okay, here it is in terms of what we ultimately, not just what the journal wants, but what you wanted, why you set out in the work, which was to clarify a new mechanism. It's not what the manuscript did, but it did hit on something extremely important for the field, right? And so you were able to, without delay, put this out as a preprint. Was it hard to convince the first author to do it as a preprint and to submit to Review Commons?
Not at all. My lab is totally convinced about the value of preprints. There is absolutely no discussion on that. Everybody loves preprints. We have preprinted pretty much everything that we have published in the last several years. It has been a win-win. The preprint issue is very well agreed upon in my lab.
Yeah, and one of the other reviewers, by the way, essentially echoed what you said about the way science should function. He said science won't progress if we don't find correction mechanisms for wrong conclusions.
Molecular biologist Thomas Lemberger is the deputy head of EMBO Press and the Review Commons project leader. Review Commons was launched in December 2019 by EMBO and ASAP Bio. It's a constantly evolving platform, and Thomas took the opportunity to send up a trial balloon.
So look, I mean, maybe I can run an idea through you to see what you think. We would like to eventually have, all the authors who go through the review process, the Review Commons review process, have their reports and reply posted next to the preprint, because it sort of disseminates this peer-reviewed research very, very fast. Now, it can be a problem to convince authors to do that precisely when the language is abrasive and violent. So we were thinking maybe we should have some kind of an appeal process where the authors can say, well, before you put this review out, change the language, because this is sort of insulting, or, the point is so totally wrong that, it sort of detracts from the entire credibility. You think it's a good idea to have such a procedure, or does it open now a can of worms?
Well, I think that it may not be necessary, because in the end, you as the editor are the arbiter. I think one thing that Tiago has once told me, which really impressed me, because I think he's spot on. I mean, he said, the editor is the reviewer or the reviewers, and that's exactly your role. No, so if you see that a comment is unprofessional, that's where you have to step in, and I don't think you should wait for the author to complain. You should actually either censor the review. I mean, I think this is well within your remit to delete parts that you think are unprofessional, or not consider the entire review altogether, and or contact the reviewer. I don't think that because the problem with the appeal is that the fact is that a rejection is a terribly is emotionally very terrible for every author, and this will never change. And I tell you, I've been in this business for more than 30 years now, and a rejection hurts as much as it did 30 years ago. It never changes, and there is a reason for that. And the reason is that when we write a paper, we put our blood's heart into it, and we work like crazy for years, and then we write a paper, and then when we send it in, it's really, in our opinion, it's a work of art, and it's a work of science, and it's perfect. And then a total stranger tells us it's not good enough, and that hurts a lot. and I'm not saying, I mean, the editor may be right, but he still hurts, and that's why as an author you can't be objective. You know, it's impossible. I mean, the author will always find the reviews to be unfair, and so the appeal process doesn't really work. In the end, it is the responsibility of the editor to balance the reviews against the claims of the author, and in the end, you cannot delegate that. You have to do it yourself.
I think the advice I always gave on appeals is people should stop first and think, are they appealing something that is factually inaccurate, which could happen and it could slip by the editor. Yep. You know, editors have their own training and something may be in a bit adjacent to the field they know best. Or are they arguing with a sentiment about something like significance, relevance, or novelty? And even those, of course, can be factually inaccurate. Someone can claim that such and such has already shown whatever, which is not the case. But normally those things don't do well, right? So to discuss taste, basically, doesn't go well. But factual appeals, I always encourage people to engage in them. The thing about tone, I think reviewers in particular should be aware of, is that the nasty tone undermines sometimes a very good review. Some reviews are just nasty, and those have been trashed in the past by many people as having no content. But sometimes they have great content, but the tone is such that it becomes a discussion about this person doesn't like me, when actually maybe they hate you, but maybe they hated your paper more, and maybe they were right. But once you engage in this kind of thing, you undermine your own argument. It gives people a leeway to not discuss the substance of the problem. So but I do think one of the things I like about making reviews public, if not necessarily reviewer identity, which is a completely separate issue, is that when Review Commons did its author survey, which I think everyone expected that the main factor of appreciation in authors would be the speed, which it did improve the speed of publication. But I think quantitatively, most authors remarked that what they actually appreciated was the change of tone in the reviews, in part because it's decoupled perhaps from the journals, but also because it's a public process, right? And
I never thought much about it, but now that you say it, yes, absolutely. I mean, the tone of the reviews. I have now sent many papers to Review Commons and plan to continue in the future. I mean, essentially, if I have a super amazing, exciting finding, and so I may try to go to Nature or so, but this happens once every 5 years, and everything else in my lab goes to Review Commons now. And you are right, the tone is more civilized than in the classical journal-centric review. It is a fact.
And it's also nice because since your replies are also public, if it's a foolish comment, even if it's anonymous, no one wants to look at themselves online and think, well, I look like a bit of a dunce in this discussion.
One reviewer of the LAC 3 paper, however, said something in the direction, Aguzzi is quoting a lot of his own papers, and this makes it look like he's an expert on synuclein, whereas he has not done anything on synuclein, something like that. But, the fact is, he was right. So I couldn't really argue.
And it's also part of, a good review can also be a really important part of the paper if we now make them public, right? I was discussing with another colleague something that they had posted on cancer, and part of the things that didn't make it into the paper were actually very good hypothesis and speculation on the part of the reviewer that just turned out not to be part of the central message, but it was an interesting discussion to see.
So this is all nice. We have Review Commons, we have preprints, we have also journals like Embo Molecular Medicine that are super efficient. I think your paper, Adriano, it sort of took the weekend to have the first decision revised. Tack, tack, tack. It went really
it
like,
was unbelievable.
like a breeze.
I mean, the speed was unbelievable. In 30 years, I've never seen anything like that. This was very impressive.
So we are all in love with these things, but the question that is looming now is who is going to pay for it now and in the future. And I know that you have thought a lot about that, and maybe one question I'd like to ask is, to run your lab, and you just explained your micro high density microtiter platform with robotics and so on. A lab has to buy equipment, expensive equipment, consumables, have to access to services, sequencing, oligos, chemical synthesis, to research infrastructure, to go to central facilities in the institution, maybe in other institutions, to use public databases and repositories. So there's an entire infrastructure. Now, a lab also needs to communicate the results, right, that others can benefit. Do you think that preprint servers, peer review platforms, and maybe even journals should be considered as core part of the research infrastructure by funders?
100%. And I have argued this in writing as well. You remember a few years ago I wrote also a piece in Nature arguing that journals, but also preprint platforms and initiatives like Review Commons should actually be given the opportunity to compete for funding at the national agencies, but also ERC and NIH and so on, and I think that I think it should be a transparent process and it should be a competitive process, and the criteria could be for among other things, obviously the features of the web platform, the turnaround time, and so on and so forth, but not the number of papers that are being published, because that is what is happening now with author processing fees. The financial incentive of the journal is to publish as many papers as possible, because if you publish 10 times as many papers, you will earn 10 times as much money. This is the worst possible way of funding scientific publications, because it's all about quantity and not about quality, and it is the reason why we have all these predatory publishers. Before open access author pays, they didn't even exist. The whole epidemic of greetings of the day has taken off with article processing charges. So I think that is really a bad way of doing open access. But what I think should be done is that in the end, the ERC, the Swiss National Foundation, Human Frontiers, and so on, they are the guys who eventually pay for the publications, because they pay the labs, and the labs eventually pay the article processing charges. So what about, so I think it would make a lot more sense, and it would be more transparent, and it would lead to better services if the funding agency would say, okay, we reserve now a pot of, I don't know, 10 million euro, 20 million euros. This is probably what the kind of money that we are talking about. And now we allow anybody to compete for this pot of money, and panels composed of scientists could evaluate and rank the proposals by the journals, because we are used to that. We do competitive funding all the time. We are reviewing each other all the time. Why can't we review the papers, the quality of the journals, and then Springer might compete, and EMBO might compete, and Swiss Medical Weekly might compete, and then I think that this would solve a major problem, which is really the coupling of the financial wealth of the journal to the number of article publishing, which is not only a problem of the predatory publishers, it's also a problem with, of the ecosystem. So why is it, I send a paper to Neuron, it all happened. Send a paper to Neuron, it's, next thing I hear is, great, wonderful, but unfortunately it's just below, the reviews are great, and so it's just below the threshold of significance that we can publish in Neuron, but why don't you go to Cell Reports? Now, the problem is Neuron is subscription-based. Cell Reports is article processing charges. So go to Cell Report, but just pay us 6,000 euros, and then everything will be fine. Now, that is a game that I don't like to play, and in fact, the paper in question ended up being published in EMBO Molecular Medicine, which so that is another thing where the big publisher are playing exactly the same game as a predatory publisher. There is no difference in the business model. There is a difference in quality of the article, but the business model is the same, and this has to stop.
Yeah, no, this is it's a fascinating idea to try to imagine that journals or publishers or platforms could apply to a competitive grant scheme. What sort of criteria would you see as a scientist as sort of important for granting such funds? What are the attributes that you would look for a publisher that should obtain such funds?
Well, I think that I would say that the scientists, the authors, would be the ones who know best what they want from the journals. And of course, I have some criteria, but I think that these things should really be decided by panels of scientists who are in the end are the customers of the journals. And I mean, obviously, certain aspects are clear. I mean, you would want to have permanent records. You want to have stability of your platform. Then you would want to see a well-documented reviewing process, turnaround times, searchability. I mean, a bunch of things. How do you deal with the ethics issue? How do you implement adherence to the DORA criteria? I mean, to the COPE criteria. So I mean, there are I would say many of these things are relatively standard, but then there would be opportunities for publishers to distinguish themselves, to innovate, and to propose unique propositions. Like, for example, I would love to have something that I would call it an executable type of paper, where rather than being with the usual PDF, you would have some way of visualizing the figures in a more interactive manner, and many things are conceivable that would enhance the readability beyond having the let's say the digital equivalent of printed paper. And so a competitive mechanism could actually enhance and encourage innovation in this field.
A paper, in the end, it's a link in the internet. It can be in Nature, it can be a blog post, it can be a preprint. And it's fantastic in a way because it allows really this super fast dissemination of everything. Institutions can document the research output immediately. Individuals can have their blog post and essentially write real time the experiments they have been doing during the day. Scientists can now post, important papers that sometimes are turn out to be wrong on preprint. And we are used in the past, we had the journals as sort of the final gatekeeper. All of these things didn't exist. And so the journal, everything was really tight up to the journal. And the journal was the big power, but also the gatekeeper. And now this function of the gatekeeper is sort of taken away or maybe diminished. And it seems that this comes with greater responsibilities by others, by individuals and by institutions. How do you see that, or how do you live that through this responsibility?
It's really a seismic change. I mean, it's a paradigm shift. You're absolutely right. The gatekeeping function has been shifted, but in a way, it's not really. It's a consequence of what is happening on the internet. It's a consequence of the way the distribution of information is changing, and really It has great advantages, but it has also the big drawback that authorities undermined, and that the diffusion of fake news is in a way is a different aspect of the same phenomenon. No? That information is being broadcasted, received, amplified without any gatekeeping, and that was in the past was more difficult because it was more expensive. You had to be the dictator of a totalitarian state in order to have to have everybody broadcasting your messages through through loudspeakers and radio. So I mean, but unless unless you were Mussolini or so, you wouldn't have the possibility to do that. And now essentially, the crazier the people are, the better their chances of getting through with this kind of fake news, and this applies to science as well. It's not only politics. So in a way, I would say to some extent we are the victim of this, and the argument mostly from Richard Sever, which I think is absolutely correct, is yes, the preprints have all these drawbacks, but don't believe for a second that the peer review protects you automatically from all these things, because the number of rubbish papers that have been peer reviewed is quite impressive, and so let's not delude ourselves. It's not like we solve the problem by getting rid of the preprints.
Well, and there is an aspect here that I think doesn't get enough attention, which is that people are becoming familiar with preprints, and including people outside of science who write about science in journalism and policymaking and who have to deal with this. But I think at least within the scientific community, it says, well, let's look at this a bit more carefully, because maybe no one else has beyond the authors and whoever critically read their manuscript, which is fine. That's what it's for. But when bad science comes out, like we had with the Surgisphere mess, for example, in a reputable peer-reviewed platform, now it has that imprimatur, right? Now it says this is likely to be good, solid, and important, right? So actually, I would argue that bad science with an imprimatur is more dangerous than bad science without it. I think what happened, particularly last year and the last couple of years, and I think we're all still a bit shell-shocked from this experience, is that the discussions that we have amongst ourselves happen with a larger audience, right? I'm sure this has been your experience. Before January 2020, everyone I discussed with online was a scientist, is still working, or an editor, or someone in scientific training. And suddenly the public rushed in, and they saw all of this, and they saw what you and Thomas very clearly identified correctly, and the reviewer of your manuscript, as good science, which is the critique, the uncertainty. But to people who are particularly scared, for example, in a public health emergency, the uncertainty looks like an accusation, and it's not, right? So this was an aspect that was difficult to manage in public, because we want to discuss these things. We want to discuss them as a community.
Correcting the scientific record, improving civility in scientific exchanges, and finding a financially sustainable way forward for open access and open science are all well and good. But whatever happened to the search for autoantibodies against LAG3?
The project kind of came to a halt. Well, I have to say not quite, because it turns out that we did find people with autoimmunity against LAG3, and this is still unpublished, but I can talk about this. It's a very interesting finding. It turns out that half of these people have a very specific disease that has nothing to do with Alzheimer's, or with Parkinson's, and they have lupus. So it turns out that anti-LAG3 immunity is very strongly associated with lupus, and nobody knew that. So this is one of these is kind of, I would call reverse immunology type of studies, where you just start with a huge population, you look in an unbiased manner at a lot of people, and then you find completely surprising connections. So that has developed in a completely different direction, and now there is a rationale also, because what is LAG3? Well, LAG3 may not be the receptor for synuclein, but one thing LAG3 is for sure. It is a checkpoint molecule. So it makes sense that if you have autoantibodies that are directed against a checkpoint molecule, of course it makes sense that you may develop an autoimmune disease. So this is now very exciting, because it also means that again, it points to a possible therapy. So you could consider, for example, blocking these antibodies with a mimicry, with a soluble LAG3, for example, to ameliorate lupus in this subset of patients. So that is, so as you see, often our science, particularly when we are doing this kind of unbiased experiments, they lead us to completely unexpected directions, and then when you see a good thing, you go for it. It doesn't really matter whether it's not really the core business of a neuropathologist, and so that is something that we are doing right now. And but then we are confronted with the fact that the claim that LAG3 is a neuronal receptor of synuclein was, well, let's put it this way, how can it put it diplomatically? We wrote in the paper, it's not universal. Let's say it's not universal, yeah.
So just to follow up on this other story of the lupus-like, or the lupus patients, a habit from mice to always refer to lupus-like, but when it's lupus patients, it's actually lupus, right? So that, as you say, is more in line with the classical LAG3 role. LAG3, one should also point out, is one of the major targets in the next generation of cancer immune checkpoint inhibitors that are currently being tested. Although several people have pointed out, because it's also to be expected, even with PD-1, CTLA-4, and we do see autoimmunity and immune pathology, several people have remarked that they wouldn't mind trading metastatic lethal lung cancer for rheumatoid arthritis. But
let me tell you one additional bit of information that is really fascinating and also kind of, in a way, exhilarating. So we found all these lupus patients, no? And then we got very excited. And then we found two patients with high titer against LAG3, and they had melanoma. And this made no sense. I mean, so why melanoma? So these patients were from the dermatology, of course. So I went to my friend Thomas Kundig, who is chair of dermatology in Zurich, and I said, look, Thomas, I mean, we have this strange finding. We have two of your melanoma patients have anti-LAG3 antibodies. So then he looked into the files, and you know what happened? You probably imagine already what the reason was. These patients were enrolled in a clinical trial sponsored by Lilly, where they were being tested humanized antibodies to LAG3 in the context of anti-melanoma therapy. So of course they had LAG3 reactivity, but it was therapeutic. Now that is, for me, really satisfying, because it shows that, it's an unexpected control. It shows that the method is sensitive, that we can actually find the antibodies if they are there. And the other really interesting thing is that when we looked at the titers in the patients with the therapeutic antibodies were very similar to the titers in the patients with lupus. So, which means that the antibodies correlating with lupus may have really been causative. So we are not talking about traces. We are talking about amounts that are similar to what you get in therapeutic context.
Thank you very much, Adriano. I don't know if Thomas has any...
No, I just want to thank you. This, as usual, a lot of fun and super insightful. We're mega grateful that you spend the time with us.
And I am grateful for everything that Review Commons is doing. I have to say it's a fantastic initiative, and obviously I am a big customer of yours.
Yes, you get the frequent flyer ticket for sure.
Exactly.